Hey guys, tonight we're heading into medieval society, a world where alcohol wasn't just something you drank after a long day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. And if you prefer listening without keeping YouTube open, Sleepless Historian is now on Spotify too. You'll find the link in the description. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a medieval village, and before you have properly convinced yourself to leave whatever collection of straw, blankets, and local wildlife you call a bed, you are already thinking about breakfast. There is bread, perhaps some cheese, maybe yesterday's leftovers, if fortune has been unusually generous. And beside all of it, there may be a cup of ale. Yes, you have been awake for approximately 12 minutes. No, apparently nobody is planning an intervention. In many parts of medieval Europe, ale or beer could be an ordinary part of the diet. Depending on your region, period, wealth, and what was available locally, relatively weak household ale might appear alongside everyday food. It provides liquid, calories, and something produced from grain that your household already knows how to turn into something considerably more exciting than porridge. But there is one famous myth we should remove immediately. You are not drinking ale because every glass of medieval water contains 3 diseases and the personal blessing of death himself. Medieval people absolutely drink water. They recognise good springs, wells, streams, and other reliable sources. Communities can care greatly about access to decent water. If you have a clean well nearby, you don't stand beside it whispering, "Not today, Satan," before sprinting toward the nearest barrel. Alcohol simply occupies a much larger place in your everyday diet than you might expect today. And breakfast shows you exactly how normal it can become. Nobody necessarily considers your morning ale a special indulgence. There is no celebration. Nobody has won a battle. Nobody's getting married. You haven't even accomplished anything yet. You are simply having breakfast. And if you're a labourer, servant, agricultural worker, or member of a busy household, calories matter. Your day might involve digging, harvesting, carrying, chopping, walking, lifting, and generally performing the duties that electricity will eventually make someone else's problem. Something made from grain, therefore, has obvious appeal. Of course, household ales can vary enormously in quality and strength. Drinking ale in the morning does not automatically mean you spend the afternoon attempting to negotiate territorial boundaries with a chicken. That distinction is important. You aren't living in a society where everybody wanders around permanently drunk. You are living in one where alcohol can sit comfortably beside ordinary nourishment. And once alcohol has secured a place at breakfast, you might assume work will finally provide a few sober hours. Unfortunately, your employer may have brought ale too. After finishing your morning ale, you might reasonably assume someone in the village had to make it for you. Perhaps there is a professional brewer somewhere nearby, working inside a large building surrounded by barrels and complicated equipment. Or you could simply turn around, because depending on where and when you live, the person brewing your ale may be standing inside your own house. For much of the medieval period, brewing could be a normal domestic activity. In many communities, women played an especially important role in producing ale for their households, and, when there was enough left over, selling some to neighbours. So your medieval home doesn't merely contain your kitchen, bedroom, workshop, children, chickens, stored grain, and at least one object nobody has cleaned since the previous king died. It can also contain your alcohol production. Brewing makes practical sense. You already depend heavily on grain. Some becomes bread, some becomes porridge, and some can be transformed into ale. The process requires work. Grain has to be prepared, liquid heated, ingredients combined, fermentation allowed to happen, and the finished drink stored and consumed before it deteriorates. And because brewing happens regularly, alcohol becomes familiar. You don't necessarily think of ale as something manufactured by a distant specialist and purchased only when you want to celebrate. You can watch it being produced alongside other household necessities. Imagine growing up around this. You wake up and there is ale. You eat and there is ale. Then somebody starts making more ale. Medieval society has apparently looked at moderation and decided it is an interesting theoretical concept, and successful household brewing can become more than domestic work. If your household produces good ale, neighbours may buy it. In English communities, women who brewed ale commercially became known as alewives, although the scale of production varied considerably. Suddenly, alcohol isn't merely something you consume. It can help your household earn money. That creates another reason for ale to remain deeply embedded in community life. Someone wants to drink it, someone else can profit from producing it, and local authorities eventually discover that anything this popular can probably be regulated and taxed. Human civilization remains remarkably consistent, but for you, the important point is simpler. Alcohol isn't hidden away behind the door of a tavern. It can begin inside the home, and once you leave that home to earn your living, things don't become particularly more sober. Because your employer might consider alcohol part of the compensation package. Eventually, you leave your household brewery and head to work. Surely this is where the drinking stops. You have fields to plough, walls to build, timber to move, animals to manage, crops to harvest, and approximately 14 hours before anyone invents workplace safety. You need to concentrate. Fortunately, your employer has prepared refreshments. Unfortunately, one of them may be ale. In medieval Europe, workers and servants could receive food and drink as part of their daily provisions. Depending on the place, period, occupation, and employer, ale, beer, cider, or wine might accompany meals during the working day. So you aren't necessarily sneaking behind the barn with a flask. The barn owner may have handed it to you. For agricultural labourers performing exhausting physical work, providing meals and drink makes practical sense. Harvesting grain, cutting hay, digging, carrying loads, and working outdoors for hours require substantial energy. Ale provides calories as well as refreshment. And because weaker varieties could be consumed as everyday drinks, handing workers ale doesn't necessarily mean the afternoon harvest immediately becomes a medieval remake of a bachelor party. You are expected to continue working, rather inconveniently. Imagine your first day. You arrive early. Someone gives you instructions. Someone gives you tools. Someone gives you ale. At this point, you may begin wondering whether you accidentally applied to work at a festival. But this is precisely what makes medieval drinking culture so interesting. Alcohol doesn't always appear as the reward that comes after work. It can appear during work. Servants living within wealthy households could similarly receive regular food and drink as part of their maintenance. The exact quantities and beverages vary enormously, but alcohol can become incorporated into the basic obligation of keeping the people working for you fed. Your compensation package is essentially room, board, ale, and the exciting possibility of surviving winter. Dental not included, and this creates another layer of normalization. You had alcohol at home. Now you've encountered it at work. You aren't required to seek out a tavern or wait for a feast. Alcohol has followed you into another ordinary part of your day, and perhaps you begin thinking that at least the church will offer some restraint. After all, medieval Christianity repeatedly warns against drunkenness. Monks devote themselves to discipline, prayer, and spiritual contemplation. Surely the monastery will finally provide a sober environment. So you approach its gates. and somewhere behind them, a monk is brewing beer. After receiving alcohol with breakfast and then discovering that your employer may provide more of it at work, you decide there must be somewhere in medieval society where drinking is treated with greater suspicion. So you turn toward religion. Surely the monastery will help. You approach expecting prayer, fasting, discipline, silence, and serious men contemplating the salvation of their souls. Then you discover the brewery. Excellent. Medieval monasteries could produce beer, ale, and wine, depending heavily on region and local agricultural conditions. Monastic communities needed food and drink for themselves, but they also offered hospitality to travellers, pilgrims, guests, and sometimes the poor, and all those people needed feeding. Which means somebody has to keep the barrels full. This doesn't mean your local monastery is secretly operating as a nightclub with Gregorian chanting in the background. Monastic rules emphasize discipline, and medieval Christianity repeatedly condemns drunkenness and excessive consumption. The important distinction is that drinking alcohol and getting drunk are not considered the same thing. Wine, in particular, already has an important place within Christianity. And where wine is difficult or expensive to obtain, other fermented drinks can become familiar parts of everyday monastic life. So you enter expecting monks to rescue you from medieval drinking culture, and instead discover that some of them are extremely competent at producing the stuff. There is something wonderfully medieval about this arrangement. You spend the morning praying against temptation. Then you spend the afternoon checking whether the fermentation is going properly. Efficiency. Monasteries can also possess advantages that help them become capable producers. They may control agricultural land, grow grain or grapes, possess storage facilities, maintain organised labour, and preserve practical knowledge across generations. Brewing isn't necessarily some chaotic monk throwing grain into a bucket and asking St. Benedict to handle the chemistry. It can be organised work. And depending on the monastery, surplus production might also be sold or exchanged, connecting religious institutions to the wider economy surrounding alcohol. For you, this creates another problem. You have now found alcohol at home. You have found it at work. And you have walked into a religious institution specifically hoping to escape it, only to discover barrels. At this stage, sobriety is beginning to feel less like a lifestyle and more like a scavenger hunt. Still, perhaps there is one person who will finally tell you to stop drinking. Your doctor. Unfortunately, medieval medicine has some ideas about wine. After discovering that even the monastery has failed to provide a reliably alcohol-free environment, you begin searching for the one medieval professional who surely has your best interests at heart. Your doctor. Perhaps you have a fever. Maybe your stomach hurts. Maybe you've developed a mysterious rash after spending 3 nights sleeping beside livestock. Whatever the problem, you expect medical advice. Instead, wine enters the conversation. Of course it does. Wine had an important place in medieval medicine. Physicians inherited medical traditions stretching back to Greek and Roman writers, particularly ideas surrounding the 4 humours. Food and drink were believed to possess qualities such as hot, cold, wet and dry, and maintaining health involved keeping these qualities properly balanced. So when you become ill, your physician doesn't simply ask what hurts. He may want to know what you've been eating, how you've been sleeping, what season it is, how old you are, and presumably whether Saturn has personally developed a grudge against you. Different wines could be assigned different qualities and recommended according to your condition. Wine could also appear as an ingredient in medicinal preparations. Herbs and other substances might be mixed or steeped in it, making alcohol part of the delivery system for remedies. Which means you've now reached the extraordinary point where drinking can potentially be described as following doctor's orders, a phrase humanity will abuse enthusiastically for centuries. Naturally, this doesn't mean medieval physicians believe unlimited wine is healthy. Medical writers can warn about excessive drinking, and moderation remains important. Your physician isn't diagnosing you with a sore knee and prescribing 12 pints. Probably. But alcohol's presence in medicine reinforces something you've already noticed. It keeps appearing in respectable settings. You drink it with meals. You encounter it while working. Monks produce it. And now medical authorities can discuss it as something capable of affecting the body in potentially useful ways. Imagine trying to explain your situation to a concerned modern friend. You've been drinking every day. It's medicinal. You had ale for breakfast. Nutritional. Your employer gave you more. Contractual. And the monks? Religious. Medieval society has provided you with an impressive administrative defense. Still, medicine isn't where alcohol becomes truly unavoidable, because you can choose not to visit a physician. You cannot choose never to meet another human being, and the moment somebody enters your home, you encounter the next problem. Being a good medieval host often means offering them a drink. After your medically approved encounter with wine, you return home hoping for a quiet evening. Then someone knocks on the door, a traveller, a neighbour, a relative, perhaps someone conducting business with you. Wonderful. You now have guests, and medieval hospitality comes with expectations. If someone enters your household, particularly someone you respect or wish to impress, offering food and drink is one of the clearest ways you can demonstrate generosity. Depending on your region, status and circumstances, that drink might be ale, beer, cider, mead, or wine. So you reach for the alcohol again. Not because you're thirsty, because you're polite. At this point, medieval society has successfully turned basic manners into another reason to open a barrel. Hospitality matters enormously in a world where travellers cannot simply book a hotel online and complain that the room looks slightly smaller than it did in the photographs. Journeys can be slow and uncomfortable, and arriving somewhere with the expectation of food, shelter, and drink is genuinely important. What you provide also says something about you. If you're wealthy and important guests arrive, serving good wine can demonstrate status. If you're living more modestly, offering ale might still show generosity. The exact drink matters less than the principle. You have something. You share it. And ideally, your guest remembers that you treated them well. Which creates an interesting social problem if you're trying not to drink. Imagine someone offering you a cup. You refuse. They offer again. You refuse again. Now, everyone is wondering whether you dislike the drink, dislike the host, are ill, are performing some unusual religious devotion, or have recently received extremely alarming news from your liver. Sharing alcohol can help establish trust and companionship. Drinking together makes the encounter warmer and more communal. And naturally, medieval people are perfectly capable of taking hospitality too far. A generous host wants your cup full. An enthusiastic guest doesn't want to insult the generous host. Several refills later, both of you have accidentally created a diplomatic crisis with a chair. But once again, the important point isn't that everyone becomes drunk. It's that alcohol has another respectable purpose. You're not drinking because you're irresponsible. You're maintaining social relationships. You've now accumulated an impressive collection of explanations. Alcohol can be nutritional, occupational, religious, medicinal, and hospitable. And soon, you discover another remarkably convenient category: professional. Because when you need to discuss money, settle an agreement, hear the latest gossip, or conduct business, there is one very useful place where everyone already gathers: the tavern. By now, Alcohol has followed you from breakfast to work, through the monastery, into the doctor's office, and finally back home when guests arrive. But tomorrow you have serious business to conduct. Surely money will sober everyone up. You need to sell some grain, negotiate payment for work, arrange the purchase of an animal, settle a debt, or discuss some other painfully responsible medieval matter. And where might you conduct this important conversation? Quite possibly somewhere serving alcohol. Alehouses, inns and taverns aren't simply places where you go to become progressively more confident about your singing ability. They can function as important social spaces where people meet, exchange information, negotiate, gamble, eat, and conduct informal business. So you sit down with someone to discuss money. Ale arrives. Apparently medieval accounting requires lubrication. Sharing a drink can help establish familiarity before negotiations begin. You talk, you exchange news, you complain about prices, you complain about taxes, you complain about the weather. Human civilization has now achieved almost complete continuity with the modern business lunch. Only nobody has PowerPoint. And because many transactions depend heavily on personal reputation and relationships, these social encounters matter. You want people to trust you. You want to hear local information. You want to know who is buying, who is selling, who owes money, and which merchant has recently developed an exciting reputation for disappearing immediately after receiving payment. The drinking establishment gives you access to all of this. You may arrive intending to discuss one transaction and leave knowing who is getting married, whose harvest failed, which traveller arrived yesterday, and why two neighbours are no longer permitted to sit beside each other. Essentially, you've opened medieval LinkedIn. Except everyone is drinking, and somehow there are fewer motivational posts. Alcohol can also accompany the completion of agreements or celebrations after successful negotiations. A shared drink helps transform a purely economic interaction into a social one. Again, you aren't necessarily drinking because you've abandoned responsibility. You may be drinking precisely because you're trying to conduct it. Of course, mixing financial decisions and alcohol has certain disadvantages that humanity will spend the next 1,000 years repeatedly rediscovering. Your brilliant purchase at 8 in the evening may look considerably less brilliant tomorrow morning when you discover you now own a goat. But alcohol has once again attached itself to another respectable part of your life. And if business gives you an excuse to drink, the medieval calendar is about to become much more generous, because eventually somebody declares a feast day. After surviving your medieval business meeting without accidentally purchasing livestock you don't need, you return to ordinary life. Then somebody announces a feast. Excellent. Because if daily life already gives you plenty of opportunities to drink, the medieval calendar is about to become your greatest supporter. Throughout the year, religious feast days, weddings, harvest celebrations, fairs, guild gatherings, local festivals, and seasonal events repeatedly bring communities together. And when people gather to celebrate, food and alcohol are rarely far away. You aren't necessarily drinking because you've had a difficult week. You might be drinking because a saint died 800 years ago. Medieval society has finally discovered the renewable excuse. Religious feast days are particularly important because the Christian calendar provides communities with recurring occasions for worship, rest, communal meals, processions, and celebration. The exact customs vary enormously by region and century, but these events can interrupt the normal rhythm of work and create opportunities for people to gather. And gathering usually means someone finds a barrel. Then there are weddings. A medieval wedding without food and drink would be a rather bleak affair, even by medieval standards. Families might provide substantial quantities of ale or wine depending on their wealth, and drinking helps turn the occasion into a public celebration. Then comes the harvest. You have spent weeks cutting, gathering, carrying, and storing crops, while hoping that rain, disease, warfare, taxation, or one particularly ambitious rat doesn't destroy your livelihood. When the work is finally finished, you celebrate. Nobody finishes the harvest and says, "Wonderful, let's commemorate this achievement with an early bedtime and some quiet reflection." The barrel is coming out. Of course, communal drinking doesn't automatically mean everyone collapses beneath the table. Medieval religious and civic authorities can condemn excessive drunkenness, disorder, violence, and behaviour that gets slightly too enthusiastic. And there is plenty of opportunity for enthusiasm, because celebrations don't merely give you access to alcohol, they give you social permission to consume more than usual. Your neighbour is drinking, your relatives are drinking, your co-workers are drinking. Someone has started singing. Someone else has decided wrestling would improve the evening. And one man has become emotionally attached to a barrel. You could refuse, of course. But once again, drinking helps you participate in the community itself. And when the celebration ends, you might think the opportunity disappears with it. It doesn't. Because tomorrow evening, there is somewhere specifically designed for you to gather, hear gossip, meet strangers, play games, and drink. The medieval tavern is waiting. After the feast ends and everyone has successfully located their homes, or at least homes that look reasonably familiar, ordinary life begins again. But you still need somewhere to socialise. Welcome to the tavern, or perhaps the alehouse or inn, depending on where you live and what kind of establishment is available. These places can offer much more than alcohol. They give you somewhere to eat, meet people, exchange information, play games, conduct business, and hear news from beyond your immediate neighbourhood. In a world without television, phones, or social media, this matters. If something interesting has happened, somebody in the tavern probably knows about it. Whether they know what actually happened is another matter entirely. You walk inside and immediately encounter your medieval information network. A traveller has arrived from another town. A merchant knows what prices are doing at the market. Someone has heard about a dispute between two local families. Someone else claims the king is preparing for war. And one man in the corner knows exactly what the king is thinking, despite having never travelled more than 12 miles from his birthplace. Some things truly are timeless. Naturally, while all this information circulates, so does alcohol. You buy ale or wine, depending on the establishment, your location, and what you can afford. Then you sit down. And that's the important part. You're not necessarily visiting purely because you desperately need alcohol. You're going because other people are there. Alcohol simply becomes the admission price to social life. You might play dice or another game. You might meet friends. You might look for work, discuss prices, hear gossip, or talk with travellers. And the longer you remain, the easier it becomes to order another drink. Then another. Suddenly, you have spent 3 hours gathering extremely important intelligence about whose cow escaped yesterday. Naturally, authorities understand that drinking establishments can also produce trouble. Gambling, arguments, drunkenness, prostitution, theft, and violence can become associated with tavern life, which is why local authorities repeatedly attempt to regulate such establishments and the people operating them. But regulation doesn't make them disappear. They are simply too useful. For you, the tavern is simultaneously a bar, restaurant, meeting room, news feed, networking event, entertainment venue, and occasionally boxing arena. And once you've spent enough time inside, you begin noticing something else. Not everyone is drinking the same thing. Because even your choice of alcohol can tell everyone exactly where you stand in medieval society. After spending enough evenings in taverns, you begin noticing something important. Everyone drinks. But everyone does not drink equally. In medieval society, what ends up inside your cup can depend heavily on where you live, what is produced locally, and most importantly, how much money you have. If you're an ordinary labourer in an ale-producing region, your regular drink might be locally brewed ale or beer. It is familiar, accessible, and doesn't need to travel halfway across Europe before reaching your table. If you're wealthy, however, things become considerably more interesting. You can afford better products, stronger drinks, imported wines, and varieties that have travelled considerable distances. Because apparently, even in the Middle Ages, drinking something expensive tastes better when everyone else knows it's expensive. Imagine you're invited to dine in a wealthy household. You sit down. Wine appears. Not merely whatever fermented liquid happened to survive in the nearest barrel, but wine purchased and transported through networks of merchants. Depending on where you live, imported wine might have travelled hundreds of miles before reaching you, and transportation costs money. So serving it communicates something. Your host isn't simply saying, "Have a drink." He's saying, "Have a drink that required 3 merchants, 2 carts, a ship, several taxis, and probably 1 horse having an absolutely terrible month." That's status. Meanwhile, poorer households generally have fewer choices. Local availability matters much more. If your region produces cider, you may drink cider. If grain-based brewing dominates, ale or beer is easier to obtain. In wine-producing regions, wine can naturally be much more ordinary. So medieval drinking culture isn't one enormous continent-wide beer festival. Your experience changes dramatically depending on geography and class, and people notice these differences. The quality of what you serve guests can reflect your household's resources. Expensive wine can become part of elite dining and hospitality, while ordinary drinks remain deeply connected to everyday life lower down the social ladder. In other words, alcohol now performs yet another job. It displays wealth. You've already used it for nourishment, work, medicine, hospitality, religion, business, and celebration. Now you're using it to impress people. Your cup has essentially become a medieval luxury watch. And naturally, once alcohol becomes this common across different levels of society, another question becomes unavoidable. If everyone around you drinks, when exactly do people decide that you drink too much? Because medieval society absolutely has an answer. And unfortunately for you, it usually begins with your behaviour. By now, alcohol has followed you through almost every respectable corner of medieval life. You drink with meals. You encounter it at work. Monks make it. Physicians use it. Hosts serve it. Taverns sell it. Wealthy people even use it to remind you that they are wealthy. So naturally, you begin wondering something. At what point does medieval society decide you have a drinking problem? And surprisingly, medieval people are perfectly capable of making a distinction between drinking alcohol and being a drunkard. The fact that alcohol is common doesn't mean drunkenness is universally admired. Quite the opposite. Christian moral teaching repeatedly condemns excessive drinking. Drunkenness can be portrayed as a sin because it weakens self-control and encourages other bad behaviour. And medieval writers have plenty of bad behaviour to choose from. Fighting, gambling, sexual misconduct, neglecting your responsibilities, saying something extremely brave to a man twice your size. Alcohol remains socially acceptable. Losing control does not, which creates an interesting situation for you. You might drink regularly without attracting much attention at all. If you have ale with breakfast, another drink with a meal, and something at a social gathering, the simple presence of alcohol doesn't automatically mark you as unusual. But if you become known for constantly getting drunk, missing work, starting fights, wasting household money, or generally transforming every tavern visit into a community emergency, people notice. Your reputation matters enormously. You don't have an online profile. You have something much worse: neighbours, and they remember everything. In a small community, being known as someone who cannot control their drinking can damage your standing. Religious authorities may condemn you. Family members suffer from your behaviour. Employers may become considerably less enthusiastic about providing your daily ale when you begin attempting to hug the livestock. So medieval society isn't saying, drink as much as physically possible. It is saying something far more complicated. Drinking can be normal. Drunkenness can be shameful. And the boundary between those two depends heavily on moderation, circumstance, and behaviour. This helps explain the strange contradiction running through medieval alcohol culture. Society can condemn excessive drinking, while simultaneously making alcohol extraordinarily easy to encounter. You are expected to control yourself. Essentially, medieval society places alcohol everywhere, and then asks you to please behave responsibly around it, a flawless system. And when enough people fail that test, local authorities become involved. But they don't usually solve the problem by simply eliminating alcohol. They regulate it. Once enough people demonstrate that combining alcohol, gambling, arguments, and medieval conflict resolution can produce predictable results, local authorities begin paying attention. Surely this is where someone finally says enough. Perhaps the town closes the alehouses. Perhaps officials discourage brewing. Perhaps medieval society decides that having alcohol available at breakfast, work, dinner, festivals, monasteries, and business meetings has created a slightly obvious problem. No, they regulate it. Because by this point, alcohol is far too embedded in ordinary life to simply disappear. Depending on where and when you live, authorities can regulate who sells ale, how much it costs, the measures used to serve it, and sometimes its quality. Sellers might face penalties for breaking local rules, while drinking establishments can come under scrutiny because of the disorder associated with them. Essentially, your town looks at alcohol and says, "We're keeping this, but we're going to need paperwork." Humanity has discovered bureaucracy. Take ale as an example. If you're selling it, customers expect to receive a proper amount for their money. Authorities have obvious reasons to prevent dishonest measures or excessive prices, particularly when ale is an important everyday product. And once governments realise large quantities of alcohol are being produced and sold, another ancient human instinct awakens: taxation. Suddenly your drinking isn't merely socially accepted, it's potentially financially useful to the authorities. Congratulations, your bad habits are contributing to public administration. Officials can also regulate taverns and alehouses because these establishments attract exactly the kinds of activities medieval authorities tend to worry about: gambling, fighting, prostitution, excessive drinking, and people remaining awake at hours when respectable citizens are presumably supposed to be asleep. There might be restrictions on opening, selling, or behaviour. But notice what usually isn't happening. Alcohol itself isn't being treated as something society can realistically remove. The goal is control. You are allowed to drink. The seller is allowed to sell. The brewer is allowed to brew. Everyone is simply expected to follow the rules and somehow remain sensible. Which, considering you've put dozens of medieval men in one room with alcohol and dice, is optimistic. But regulation tells you just how deeply established drinking has become. Your rulers aren't standing outside the system trying to destroy it. They're managing it. And after all these rules, taxes, measurements and restrictions, there remains one force even harder to regulate than the tavern. Your friends. Because when everyone around you raises a cup, refusing one can become surprisingly complicated. By now, the authorities have done their best. They regulate sellers. They inspect measures. They punish disorder. They establish rules for places where alcohol is sold. There is just one problem. Your friends don't care about regulations. You sit down with neighbours, co-workers, relatives, guild members, or travelling companions, and somebody produces a drink. Then they offer you one. You could refuse, technically. But drinking together in medieval society can carry meaning beyond simply consuming alcohol. Sharing food and drink helps reinforce friendship, hospitality, occupational bonds, and community relationships. When everyone around the table participates, raising your cup becomes part of belonging to the group. So someone pours you ale, you drink. They pour another, you drink again. At some point you realise nobody has actually asked whether you're thirsty. This is now a team-building exercise, and drinking rituals can make refusal socially awkward. Accepting someone's hospitality shows goodwill. Sharing a drink can demonstrate trust. Buying or providing drinks can display generosity. If you repeatedly refuse, people may begin wondering why. Are you ill? Are you fasting? Are you too poor to return the favour? Do you dislike your host? Or, most concerning of all, are you about to say something beginning with, "I've been thinking lately"? Suddenly drinking is easier. This becomes especially powerful when your identity is connected to a particular group. Craftsmen, labourers, soldiers, merchants, neighbours, and members of associations or guilds can all socialise around shared meals and drinks. You don't necessarily go out because you desperately want alcohol. You go because your people are going. The alcohol simply follows. And once everyone starts drinking together, generosity can become competitive. Someone buys a round. Another person doesn't want to appear stingy, so they provide the next. Now you feel obliged to participate. 3 rounds later, everyone has successfully demonstrated friendship and unsuccessfully demonstrated mathematics. Of course, medieval moralists understand the danger. Companionship can encourage excess just as easily as moderation. One person's sensible drink becomes another person's challenge, and social pressure can keep cups full long after anyone actually needs another. That is what makes alcohol so difficult to separate from medieval society. You're not merely resisting a beverage. Sometimes you're resisting a social ritual. And even if you somehow defeat breakfast ale, workplace provisions, taverns, celebrations, hospitality, and your extremely persistent friends, there is a larger problem waiting behind all of them. By now, an entire economy depends on keeping your cup full. By now, you've discovered that avoiding alcohol requires considerable effort, but perhaps you can simply stop buying it. Unfortunately, medieval society has developed another problem. Alcohol is making people money. By the later Middle Ages, especially in towns and commercially active regions, brewing, winemaking, transportation, storage, and selling alcoholic drinks can support a surprisingly large network of livelihoods. Your cup doesn't begin at the tavern. It begins in a field. Someone grows barley, wheat, oats, grapes, or apples. Someone harvests them. Someone processes the grain or presses the fruit. Someone brews the ale, makes the beer, or produces the wine. Then someone needs to store it. Someone needs to transport it. Someone needs to sell it. And finally, you arrive and heroically complete the supply chain. You're basically doing your part for the economy. Brewers and alewives can earn money producing drinks for their communities. Tavern keepers and innkeepers depend on customers. Merchants transport wine between regions, sometimes over considerable distances. Craftsmen manufacture barrels and other containers. Even governments can benefit through taxes, tolls, licenses, fines and regulations connected to the alcohol trade. At this point, your pint has more people financially interested in its survival than some medieval villages. And that's important, because once alcohol becomes economically valuable, society has another reason to keep producing it. Imagine you're a successful brewer. Your household depends on brewing income. Your customers depend on you for ale. Local farmers sell you ingredients. Other workers transport what you produce. Then somebody arrives and announces that everyone should probably drink less. You are unlikely to nominate this person for mayor. The same applies to wine. Wine can become an important commercial commodity, moving through regional and international trading networks. Ports, merchants, landowners, transporters, retailers and authorities can all benefit from its movement. Alcohol is no longer merely something people enjoy. It's business. And business creates momentum. Even when authorities worry about drunkenness, they are regulating an industry that provides employment, trade, and revenue. So medieval society finds itself in a wonderfully familiar position. Too much drinking causes problems, but selling the drinks is profitable. Humanity will continue exploring this contradiction with tremendous enthusiasm. And after 14 reasons, you finally reach the strange heart of the whole story. Because medieval society wasn't actually designed for alcoholics. It was built around something much more ordinary. Alcohol itself. After 14 chapters of trying unsuccessfully to escape alcohol, you can finally look back at your medieval life. You woke up and found ale at breakfast. You discovered brewing inside ordinary homes. You went to work, and your employer provided more. You sought refuge in a monastery and discovered monks making it. You became sick, and your physician found a way to involve wine. You welcomed a guest, and politeness demanded another drink. You conducted business in a tavern, celebrated feast days with your neighbours, and discovered that even your choice of beverage could announce how wealthy you were. At this point, you haven't developed a drinking problem. You've developed a medieval schedule, and that distinction explains the title. Medieval society wasn't literally built for alcoholics. Medieval people recognized excessive drinking as a problem. Religious authorities condemned drunkenness. Communities understood the damage caused by people who drank beyond accepted limits. Governments regulated taverns and cellars, partly because alcohol could lead to disorder. Nobody watches you fall face first into a barrel and declares you an outstanding citizen. But alcohol itself is different. It has become woven into so many ordinary parts of your existence that avoiding it completely can require more effort than consuming it. Alcohol can provide calories. It can form part of hospitality. It can accompany wages and meals. It can appear in medicine. It can generate income. It can demonstrate wealth. It can strengthen social bonds. It can accompany weddings, festivals, religious celebrations, business negotiations, and the simple act of sitting beside your neighbours after work. And that's what makes the medieval relationship with drinking so fascinating. The society around you can warn constantly against drunkenness, while simultaneously giving you perfectly respectable reasons to drink. Essentially, everyone agrees that you shouldn't drink too much. Then they hand you another cup. A remarkably ambitious public health strategy. So if you were genuinely struggling with alcohol in the Middle Ages, the world around you could make restraint particularly difficult. You wouldn't necessarily need to seek alcohol out. It could already be waiting at home, at work, at dinner, at the celebration, or at the tavern where your friends expect you. The medieval world wasn't one enormous drunken party. Most people still had fields to work, families to support, businesses to run, prayers to attend, and animals determined to escape at inconvenient moments. But alcohol was everywhere around those responsibilities, and perhaps that's the strangest conclusion of all. You didn't need an excuse to drink. You needed an excuse not to. If you travelled through medieval Ireland looking for the king, you would quickly discover that you needed to be much more specific. Which king? Because Ireland had plenty of them. Unlike England or France, medieval Ireland was not organised around one powerful monarch ruling a neatly defined kingdom. Instead, the island was divided into dozens of smaller territories, each controlled by its own dynasty and, quite often, its own king. Some ruled substantial regions. Others controlled territories so small that a determined traveller could probably leave the kingdom before lunch. Yet the title was perfectly legitimate. At the foundation of Irish politics was the Tuath, a local political community made up of several kin groups. The Tuath had its own territory, laws, elite families, and ruler. That ruler could be called a king, even though his authority might extend only across a relatively small area. This immediately created something unusual. Kings could have kings above them. A local ruler might recognize a stronger regional king. That regional king might answer to an even more powerful provincial ruler. And above all of them, occasionally, stood someone claiming to be High King of Ireland. Medieval Irish politics was basically a pyramid in which nearly everyone seemed to have found a crown somewhere. But these rulers were not ceremonial figures. Even a relatively minor king had serious responsibilities. He was expected to protect his territory, maintain alliances, settle political disputes, reward followers, host impressive feasts, and lead warriors when necessary. And, very importantly, protect cattle. Cattle represented wealth, status, and economic power, which meant neighbouring rulers developed an unfortunate habit of stealing them from one another. Nothing strengthens international relations quite like discovering that the king next door has disappeared with 40 of your cows. But the real complication was succession. Kingship did not automatically pass from father to eldest son. Several men belonging to the ruling dynasty could potentially qualify for power. Brothers, nephews, cousins, and other relatives might all possess legitimate ambitions. So every king was surrounded by family members who loved him deeply and would also quite like his job. This prevented political power from settling permanently in one pair of hands. A dynasty could weaken. A neighbouring ruler could grow stronger. Alliances could change almost overnight. Smaller kingdoms could become subordinate to larger ones without disappearing entirely. And that is the key to understanding why Ireland had so many kings. Conquest did not necessarily remove kings. It often simply gave them another king to answer to, which meant that the real question in medieval Ireland was rarely whether someone was a king. It was how many other kings he could convince to obey him. Once you understand that medieval Ireland was divided into many small political communities, the ridiculous number of kings begins to make considerably more sense. The basic unit was often the Tuath. Rather than imagining a country divided into large provinces with governors answering to a central monarch, imagine dozens of local territories, each containing communities tied together by kinship, law, land, and political allegiance. Many had their own ruler, and yes, he could be called a king. To modern ears, this sounds excessive. We tend to reserve the word king for someone ruling an entire country. In medieval Ireland, however, kingship existed at several levels. Your local king might control only a relatively modest territory. Several neighbouring kings might then recognise a stronger ruler above them. That ruler could dominate a larger regional kingdom, while still allowing the smaller kings to remain in place. So defeating another king did not necessarily mean taking his crown. Sometimes you simply made his crown less impressive. This created a layered political system. At the bottom were rulers of smaller kingdoms. Above them stood more powerful regional kings. Above those were major provincial rulers associated with places such as Munster, Leinster, Connaught, and Ulster. And somewhere at the very top was the possibility of becoming High King. But political boundaries were never completely fixed. A successful dynasty could expand its influence, forcing neighbouring rulers to pay tribute or provide soldiers. A weaker dynasty might lose territory. Another could split into rival branches, producing new political struggles. Ireland's map was therefore constantly being adjusted by marriages, warfare, inheritance, and the medieval tradition of refusing to leave your neighbours alone. Geography reinforced this localism. Mountains, rivers, forests, and bogs separated communities and made political control more difficult. A ruler who lived relatively nearby could provide protection and leadership in ways that some distant monarch simply could not. People therefore remained strongly connected to local territories and dynasties, and those dynasties were not eager to disappear. Even when a powerful king established supremacy over several smaller territories, completely replacing their ruling families could be difficult and unnecessary. It was often easier to leave local kings in position and demand loyalty from them. This allowed kingdoms to stack on top of one another. One king could rule his people while answering to another king, who might himself recognize an even stronger king. It sounds confusing because it was. But there was an advantage. For an ambitious ruler, all those tiny kingdoms created a political ladder, and if you could climb high enough, your little crown might eventually become a very important one. Having dozens of kingdoms was already complicated enough. Medieval Ireland then added another wonderfully unstable ingredient. Kingship did not automatically pass from father to eldest son. There was no simple moment where the king died. Everyone looked at his oldest boy, handed him the crown, and went home. Instead, kingship belonged to a royal dynasty. Several adult men within that dynasty might be considered suitable candidates. A king's brother could have a claim. So could his nephew. His cousin might be interested. Another branch of the family might suddenly remember that their grandfather had once ruled something important. Basically, the family tree doubled as a list of potential threats. This system had some practical advantages. A kingdom was less likely to end up ruled by a 6-year-old simply because his father had died unexpectedly. Ideally, the next king would be an experienced adult, capable of leading warriors, negotiating alliances, distributing wealth, and protecting the kingdom. Unfortunately, having several qualified candidates created the obvious problem. They all wanted the job. An ambitious royal relative therefore needed supporters long before the throne became available. He might build relationships with warriors, important families, neighbouring rulers, and religious communities. The stronger his network became, the stronger his claim became. This meant succession politics could begin while the current king was still very much alive. Imagine sitting at a feast while your cousin spends the evening being suspiciously generous to everyone who owns a sword. You might start asking questions. Kings therefore had to manage their own families almost as carefully as foreign enemies, and removing one rival rarely solved everything. A defeated cousin might have brothers. A dead uncle might leave sons. A displaced branch of the dynasty could wait years for an opportunity to return. Political grudges had excellent inheritance rates. This constant competition also made larger kingdoms difficult to hold together. A powerful ruler might dominate several territories, but weakness at the centre could encourage rival relatives and subordinate kings to challenge him. One bad military defeat could suddenly make alternative candidates look much more attractive. And because authority depended heavily on personal loyalty, kings needed to keep rewarding the people supporting them. Power was never simply inherited, it had to be maintained. That helps explain why Irish politics could change so quickly. Dynasties divided, cousins competed, alliances shifted, former allies became enemies, while yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's extremely convenient friend. So if you were a medieval Irish king, watching the neighbouring kingdoms was important. But occasionally, the man you really needed to watch was sitting across the dinner table. Being surrounded by rival kings was dangerous enough. Being surrounded by rival kings who could change sides whenever it suited them made medieval Irish politics considerably more interesting. No ruler could survive entirely on military strength. You needed allies. A smaller king might accept the authority of a stronger ruler because that ruler offered protection against another dynasty. Two kingdoms might cooperate against a common enemy. Royal families could strengthen relationships through marriage, while fosterage created personal bonds between powerful families. Everything worked perfectly. Until it didn't. Because alliances were rarely permanent. Imagine that your kingdom sits between two stronger rivals. One of them defeats you, so you recognize him as your overlord and provide warriors when requested. Then, several years later, your powerful overlord loses an important battle. Suddenly, you remember how deeply committed you have always been to independence. Medieval Irish politics rewarded flexibility. A king who remained loyal to a collapsing ally simply because they had made an agreement years earlier might soon discover that principles were not particularly effective against armed neighbours. This meant powerful rulers constantly had to maintain their networks. They distributed gifts, arranged marriages, accepted hostages, demanded tribute, and called subordinate kings into military service. Hostages were particularly useful. If another ruler promised loyalty, keeping one of his relatives nearby provided a little encouragement for him to remember that promise. Medieval diplomacy occasionally lacked subtlety, but even hostages could not guarantee permanent obedience. A subordinate king might cooperate because resisting was currently impossible, not because he had suddenly developed enormous affection for his overlord. The moment circumstances changed, so could his loyalty. This created a major problem for anyone attempting to dominate large parts of Ireland. The more territory you controlled, the more relationships you had to maintain. Every subordinate king represented additional soldiers and tribute, but he also represented another possible rebellion. And rival rulers understood this perfectly. Rather than defeating a powerful king directly, they could attempt to weaken his alliance network, convince several lesser rulers to defect, and suddenly an impressive political empire began looking surprisingly fragile. Marriage could make things even more complicated. Royal marriages created alliances between dynasties, but they also produced children with connections to multiple ruling families, which meant today's peaceful marriage settlement could quietly manufacture tomorrow's succession dispute. So medieval Irish kingship depended on something more delicate than simply owning territory. It depended on relationships. A powerful ruler was powerful because other rulers accepted, feared, or benefited from his authority. And if enough of them stopped doing that, his impressive kingdom could shrink very quickly. This was especially important for the greatest prize of all, becoming High King of Ireland. At the top of this complicated ladder of kingship stood the most impressive title available, High King of Ireland. That sounds simple enough. If Ireland had dozens of kings and one man was the High King, surely he ruled all the others. Not exactly. The High King claimed supremacy over other Irish rulers, but his actual authority depended on how powerful he was. There was no permanent central government sending officials into every kingdom and collecting taxes on his behalf. Instead, supremacy had to be built, and then constantly defended. A successful High King needed other rulers to acknowledge his superiority, provide tribute, offer hostages, or support him militarily. Some submitted willingly because an alliance benefited them. Others submitted because an army had recently explained the situation. But submission did not mean those kings disappeared. They remained rulers of their own territories. This was the strange beauty of the Irish system. You could become the greatest king in Ireland without actually removing most of the other kings. For centuries, powerful dynasties competed for this position. The Wee Nel became especially influential, producing rulers who claimed supremacy over large parts of the island. But their dominance was never completely secure. Kings in Munster, Leinster, Connaught, and elsewhere could grow powerful enough to challenge them. The most famous example came around the year 1000. Brian Boru rose from the Dal G Cais dynasty in Munster and gradually transformed himself from a regional ruler into the dominant political figure in Ireland. He defeated rivals, forced other kings into submission, built alliances, and eventually established authority across much of the island. For a moment, Ireland came remarkably close to having one overwhelmingly powerful ruler, but Brian's achievement also revealed the weakness of the system. His authority depended heavily on him. The subordinate kingdoms still existed, their dynasties still existed, their ambitions certainly still existed. When Brian died after the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, his political supremacy did not simply pass intact to a successor. The competition began again. That was the problem with becoming High King. You could defeat other rulers, you could demand their tribute, you could take their hostages. You could even make them acknowledge you as the most powerful king in Ireland, but you could not make them stop being kings. And somewhere among those rulers was almost certainly a man waiting for you to become weak. Because reaching the top of medieval Irish politics was difficult. Staying there was worse. With so many kings competing for land, cattle, tribute, and prestige, medieval Ireland naturally experienced plenty of warfare. But these wars often worked differently from the wars of later centralised kingdoms. A king did not necessarily attack his neighbour because he wanted to erase that kingdom from the map. Often, he simply wanted the neighbouring king to admit that he was more powerful. This could mean demanding tribute, taking hostages, stealing livestock, securing military support, or forcing the defeated ruler to recognise him as an overlord. And then everyone went home, including, rather inconveniently, the defeated king. He might still control his territory. His dynasty might still possess influence. His warriors had not necessarily disappeared. He had simply moved one level lower on Ireland's political ladder. This meant victory could be surprisingly temporary. Once the victorious army left, the defeated ruler could begin rebuilding his strength, searching for allies, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to forget the agreement he had just made. Cattle raiding was particularly common because livestock represented enormous wealth. Stealing cattle weakened your enemy while giving you something valuable to distribute among your own followers, and kings needed to reward followers. Warriors were considerably more enthusiastic about supporting a ruler, when supporting him occasionally resulted in acquiring someone else's cows. Military success therefore strengthened political power. A victorious king gained wealth and prestige. That attracted more supporters. More supporters gave him greater military strength, allowing him to pressure additional kingdoms. The problem came when he expanded too far. Controlling distant territories was difficult. Ireland had mountains, rivers, forests, and enormous stretches of boggy terrain that complicated travel and campaigning. Local rulers understood their own territories and possessed networks of relatives and supporters there. So instead of directly administering every conquered kingdom, powerful rulers often left local kings in place. They demanded obedience rather than replacement. This was practical. It was also one reason Ireland continued producing so many kings. Even successful conquest often preserved the existing political structure. A powerful provincial ruler could therefore dominate numerous smaller kingdoms without actually transforming them into one centralised state. And the larger his network became, the harder it was to maintain. While he was campaigning in one region, another subordinate ruler might rebel somewhere else. One defeat could encourage several kings to switch sides. One death could reopen old succession disputes. One ambitious cousin could make everything considerably worse. So warfare could create powerful kings, but it rarely created permanent unity. Again and again, rulers expanded their influence only to watch parts of it break away later. And by the 12th century, this fragmented political world was about to face something different. Foreign warriors who would not simply join Ireland's competition between kings. They would begin changing the game itself. By the 12th century, Ireland's political system had spent generations doing what it did best. Kings fought other kings. Dynasties competed for territory. Alliances appeared, disappeared, and occasionally reappeared when everyone involved suddenly discovered that yesterday's enemy was useful again. Then one Irish king made a decision that would change the island permanently. His name was Diarmaid mac Murchada, King of Leinster. In 1166, Diarmaid was driven from his kingdom by a coalition of Irish enemies led by Ruaidhrí wa Conchobar, the powerful king of Connacht, who had become High King. For many rulers, losing a kingdom would have been the end of the story. Diarmaid treated it more like an administrative inconvenience. He travelled abroad seeking help and eventually secured support from Anglo-Norman warriors, promising rewards in exchange for military assistance. They began arriving in Ireland in 1169, and they were very effective. Diarmaid recovered much of his position, but the foreign warriors had ambitions of their own. Men such as Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, acquired lands and political influence. What had begun as another Irish dynastic dispute was becoming something much larger. In 1171, King Henry II of England arrived in Ireland. Now Ireland's kings were dealing with a ruler whose political system worked very differently from their own. Yet even this did not immediately end Gaelic kingship. Irish kings continued ruling large territories for centuries. Some fought the newcomers, others formed alliances with them. Irish dynasties and Anglo-Norman families married, negotiated, competed, and occasionally adopted one another's customs. Ireland remained complicated, and that reveals something important about why the island had contained so many kings in the first place. It was not simply because medieval Ireland was chaotic. The system was designed around layers of local authority. Small kingdoms could retain their rulers while recognizing stronger kings above them. Royal dynasties could survive military defeats. Political power depended heavily on family connections, alliances, tribute, military success, and personal reputation. Being conquered did not automatically mean disappearing. Being called king did not automatically mean ruling thousands of square miles either. One king might control a relatively small territory, another might dominate several kings, another might claim authority over an entire province. And the most ambitious could call himself High King. So when medieval Ireland appears to have an almost unreasonable number of kings, that is because the word king described several levels of political power. The interesting question was never simply whether a man was king. It was who obeyed him. Because in medieval Ireland, having a crown was impressive. Having other kings listen to you was what really mattered. For many couples in the ancient world, getting married was only the beginning. Once the celebrations ended and everyone finally stopped eating, drinking, and discussing the marriage, another question quickly appeared. Where were the children? Producing children could be one of the most important expectations placed upon a married couple. Children continued the family line, became heirs, helped preserve property, cared for parents in old age, and, in some cultures, performed religious duties connected with dead ancestors. So conception was not always treated as a private matter between two people. The entire family could become interested, which is exactly what every newly married couple wants. Ancient people understood the basic relationship between sexual intercourse and pregnancy, but the biological details remained mysterious. Without knowledge of ovulation, hormones, sperm cells, or many causes of infertility, people developed explanations that combined observation, traditional medicine, religion, and magic. If pregnancy happened quickly, wonderful. The gods were apparently satisfied. If months or years passed without a child, things became considerably more complicated. Perhaps the couple had offended a deity. Perhaps an evil influence was interfering. Perhaps the woman's body was considered too cold, too dry, too wet, or otherwise inconveniently arranged according to whichever medical theory happened to be popular. Sometimes the man was considered responsible as well, although women often carried much more of the blame. And because nobody could easily determine the actual cause, couples had plenty of possible solutions. They could visit temples. They could pray to fertility deities. They could make offerings, wear amulets, follow special rituals, eat particular foods, or try remedies recommended by healers. Often, several approaches could be used together. There was no reason to choose between medicine and divine assistance when you could annoy both your physician and several gods at the same time. But beneath the strange remedies was genuine anxiety. Infertility could affect inheritance, family status, and the security of a marriage. For elite families especially, producing legitimate heirs could become politically and economically important. So couples searched for anything that promised hope. A particular goddess might help. A certain charm might protect conception. A specific food might encourage fertility. A ritual performed correctly might persuade supernatural forces to cooperate. And this is where ancient fertility practices become fascinating. Because before couples experimented with complicated remedies, many began with the most powerful force they understood. They asked the gods for help. Once an ancient couple became worried about fertility, one of the most obvious places to seek assistance was not the bedroom or the physician's house. It was the temple. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, fertility was closely connected with religion. Pregnancy seemed mysterious, dangerous, and only partly under human control, so divine assistance made perfect sense. Different societies naturally had different gods available for the job. In ancient Egypt, women could appeal to Hathor, associated with sexuality, motherhood, and fertility. Taweret, the protective hippopotamus-shaped goddess, became closely associated with pregnancy and childbirth. Bes, another protective deity, was also invoked around domestic life, sexuality, and birth. The Greeks had their own divine options. Hera was strongly connected with marriage, while Artemis could be associated with childbirth despite being famously uninterested in marriage herself. Aphrodite represented sexuality and desire, and other local deities could acquire fertility associations depending on the sanctuary and region. The Romans similarly appealed to divine powers connected with marriage, conception, and childbirth, including Juno. The important thing was not simply praying. Couples might make offerings. Food, wine, incense, small objects, figurines or other gifts could be dedicated at sanctuaries. A person asking for divine assistance might promise another offering if the request was granted. It was essentially a sacred agreement. Please provide a baby, and there may be a very respectable gift in your future. Some sanctuaries became particularly associated with healing or reproductive concerns. People travelled to sacred places seeking solutions that ordinary household remedies had failed to provide, and the ritual itself mattered. Prayers might need to be spoken correctly. Offerings had to be appropriate. Religious purity could matter before approaching certain sacred spaces. This gave couples something extremely valuable during an uncertain situation. Something to do. That should not be underestimated. When conception refused to happen and nobody understood why, performing a ritual created a sense that the couple was actively addressing the problem rather than simply waiting. Religion also provided an explanation for success. If pregnancy followed a visit to a sanctuary, the deity had listened. And if nothing happened, perhaps another offering was necessary. Perhaps another deity should be consulted. Perhaps the problem required something stronger. Because ancient couples were rarely limited to prayer alone. Once you had asked the gods politely, you could move on to another layer of protection, magic. And this is where fertility charms, amulets and protective objects started becoming considerably more interesting. Praying to the gods was useful, but ancient couples were not necessarily interested in relying on prayer alone. Sometimes you wanted something you could actually carry around. That was where charms and amulets became useful. Across several ancient cultures, people wore or kept small objects believed to protect fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. These could feature divine images, animals, symbols, written formulas, or materials believed to possess protective qualities. In ancient Egypt, protective amulets were particularly common. Images connected with deities such as Taweret and Bez could appear around women, households, and childbirth. Taweret, with her unusual combination of hippopotamus, lion, and crocodile features, was hardly subtle. But subtlety was probably not what you wanted from supernatural security. Objects associated with fertility could be worn on the body or kept within domestic spaces. Their purpose was not necessarily to cause conception directly. Some were intended to protect the woman from harmful forces that people believed could interfere with pregnancy or threaten mother and child. Elsewhere, magical traditions could become even more elaborate. In the Greek and Roman worlds, people used engraved gems and amulets for numerous purposes, including health, sexuality, protection, and reproductive concerns. Magical texts from the wider Mediterranean world also preserve spells involving spoken formulas, written words, ritual actions, and carefully selected objects. To modernize, placing your hopes for pregnancy in an engraved stone seems strange. But ancient people did not necessarily separate medicine, religion, and magic as neatly as we do. A person might visit a physician, pray to a deity, and wear a protective charm without seeing any contradiction whatsoever. Why choose one method when you can cover every available department? And fertility was exactly the sort of uncertainty that encouraged this approach. Nobody could see conception happening. Nobody could reliably explain why one couple conceived quickly while another struggled for years. That invisible uncertainty left plenty of room for supernatural explanations. Perhaps hostile magic was responsible. Perhaps an evil spirit was interfering. Perhaps the body needed protection. Perhaps the right symbol could encourage the forces responsible for fertility. So amulets offered something psychologically powerful as well as religiously meaningful. They remained with you. Unlike an offering left behind at a sanctuary, a charm could be carried against the body as constant protection. But ancient couples were not finished. If divine assistance could come through prayers and magical objects, perhaps fertility could also be encouraged through something much more ordinary: food. And naturally, ancient people had plenty of opinions about what should be eaten. Once prayers and charms had been tried, ancient couples could turn towards something much easier to control: dinner. Ancient medical writers frequently connected food with health, sexuality, bodily fluids, and reproduction. If the body could be strengthened or balanced through diet, then perhaps the right foods could also improve the chances of conception. Naturally, everyone had opinions. Certain foods gained reputations for encouraging sexual desire or fertility because of their appearance, abundance of seeds, perceived warming qualities, or associations with particular gods. Figs, pomegranates, dates, grapes, nuts, eggs, and honey could all carry associations with abundance, sexuality, or fertility in different ancient cultures. The pomegranate became especially symbolic. Packed with seeds, it was an obvious image of abundance and reproduction. In Greek mythology, it was famously connected with Persephone, while in various Mediterranean contexts, its many seeds made it an easy symbol of fertility and life. Apparently, ancient symbolism occasionally required very little imagination. Medical theories added another layer. Greek and Roman physicians often understood the body through systems involving heat, cold, moisture, dryness, and bodily fluids. Foods were believed to influence these qualities. If someone's body seemed unsuitable for conception, changing the diet might supposedly correct the imbalance. Some foods were thought to increase sexual desire. Others were recommended because they were believed to strengthen the body or improve reproductive function. And then there were herbs. Ancient medical texts contain numerous plant-based preparations connected with menstruation, conception, pregnancy, contraception, and childbirth. Some plants may genuinely have affected the body, while others probably contributed mainly an unpleasant taste and a memorable afternoon. Still, the logic made sense within ancient medicine. You could not see what was happening inside the reproductive system, but you could control what entered the body. So food became another way of attempting to influence an uncertain process. Couples might combine dietary advice with religious practices without seeing any contradiction. You could eat the recommended foods, wear your protective amulet, make an offering, and continue praying. At that point, practically everyone except the neighbour's cat had been consulted. But fertility foods also reveal something important about ancient thinking. Reproduction was not treated as one isolated biological event. It was connected with the condition of the entire body. Health, diet, sexuality, divine favour and fertility could all overlap. And if changing what you ate might help, people were willing to try. But food was still relatively ordinary. Some couples went much further. Because ancient fertility traditions also included rituals where the exact place, timing, words, and actions were believed to matter. Food could prepare the body, but ancient couples often believed fertility also depended on doing certain things in exactly the right way. This was where rituals became particularly important. Across the ancient world, marriage and fertility were surrounded by symbolic actions. Some occurred during weddings themselves, while others could be performed later when couples became concerned that children were not arriving. Timing could matter. Certain days, festivals, lunar phases, or religious occasions might be considered especially favourable. Couples could visit sanctuaries associated with fertility, marriage, or childbirth, and perform prescribed acts while asking for divine assistance. Sometimes the ritual involved bathing or purification. Before approaching a deity, a person might wash, change clothing, or avoid certain activities. Purification symbolically prepared the worshipper to enter sacred space and make a request. Because apparently asking the gods for a child required being properly presentable. Other rituals involve touching sacred objects, tying or untying knots, dedicating clothing, carrying particular symbols, or leaving offerings connected with fertility. In some traditions, the symbolism was straightforward. Seeds represented growth. Fruit represented abundance. Flowers represented new life. Objects associated with children could represent the outcome being requested. The ritual created a physical version of the prayer. Instead of merely saying, "Give us children," the worshipper demonstrated the request through objects and actions. Marriage ceremonies themselves could also contain fertility symbolism. In Greece and Rome, weddings involved religious sacrifices, processions, prayers, special clothing, food, and rituals surrounding the bride's transition into her husband's household. The hope for future children was never very far away. For elite families especially, this mattered enormously. A marriage without an heir could create inheritance problems and threaten carefully arranged family plans. The newly married couple might therefore receive plenty of encouragement concerning fertility from relatives who had absolutely no intention of minding their own business. But rituals offered reassurance. If the correct actions had been performed, the couple had done what tradition expected. They had purified themselves. They had honoured the gods. They had made the appropriate offerings. They had followed the proper customs. Now they could wait. Of course, waiting was precisely the difficult part. If pregnancy still did not happen, ancient couples could begin wondering whether the problem was not religious at all. Perhaps something was physically wrong. And once ancient physicians became involved, fertility advice moved from sacred rituals into an entirely different world of examinations, theories, mixtures, and tests. Some were surprisingly observant. Others were about to make the fertility charm look extremely reasonable. If prayers, charms, food, and rituals failed to produce a pregnancy, an ancient couple might eventually seek something resembling medical advice. This did not necessarily make things less strange. Greek and Roman medical writers tried to explain fertility through the physical workings of the body. They discussed menstruation, sexual intercourse, bodily fluids, age, general health, and the condition of the reproductive organs. Some observations were surprisingly sensible, others were confidently wrong. Ancient physicians often believed that successful conception depended on both partners producing the right bodily conditions at the right moment. Medical theories differed, but many writers believed the woman's body needed to be properly balanced in terms of heat, moisture, and other qualities. If something seemed wrong, treatment might involve diet, exercise, baths, herbs, oils, or various preparations. There were also fertility tests. One famous type of ancient test involved placing strongly scented substances near a woman's lower body and later checking whether the smell could supposedly be detected from her mouth or nose. The logic was that an open passage through the body indicated that her reproductive organs were unobstructed. This was not how anatomy worked, but it probably made the examination memorable. Other methods attempted to determine whether infertility came from the man or the woman. Ancient writers did sometimes acknowledge male infertility, which is important because reproductive failure was not universally blamed on women. Still, women usually faced far more scrutiny. Their menstrual cycles could be examined. Their bodies could be treated with fumigations or preparations. Physicians might recommend particular sexual timing, or positions believed to improve the likelihood of conception. The bedroom had officially acquired technical instructions, and medical treatment did not necessarily replace religion. A woman could follow a physician's recommendation in the morning and visit a sanctuary later. To an ancient person, these approaches could complement one another. Medicine treated the body. Ritual addressed divine forces. Magic offered protection. Diet encouraged balance. If you were desperate for a child, using all four probably seemed more sensible than choosing only one. And desperation mattered. For couples whose social security, inheritance, or family reputation depended on producing children, years without pregnancy could become deeply stressful. Every unsuccessful remedy created another reason to try something different. Another physician, another offering, another herb, another ritual. Because ancient fertility treatments ultimately reveal something very familiar beneath all the strange theories. People wanted control over something they could not control. And when every practical method failed, there was still one final possibility. Perhaps conception depended less on medicine than on convincing fate itself to cooperate. After the prayers, offerings, charms, special foods, rituals, and medical treatments, an ancient couple could still face the same uncomfortable reality. There was no child. And this was where fertility beliefs reveal something surprisingly human about the ancient world. People kept trying. A couple might return to a sanctuary and make another offering. They might appeal to a different deity, consult another healer, change their diet, obtain a new amulet, or perform a ritual recommended by someone who confidently insisted that their cousin had tried it and immediately become pregnant. Some things never change, but beneath the occasionally strange methods was genuine fear. Children were often deeply connected with economic security, inheritance, social status, and the continuation of the household. In some societies, descendants were also responsible for maintaining family religious traditions and honouring the dead. For wealthy families, the stakes could become even greater. Property needed heirs. Political alliances created through marriage were expected to produce descendants. A marriage that remained childless could therefore become a problem extending far beyond the couple themselves. And unfortunately, women often carried the greatest burden. Although some ancient medical traditions recognized that men could contribute to infertility, social suspicion frequently focused on the wife. She might endure treatments, examinations, prayers, and rituals, while relatives waited impatiently for results. Imagine experiencing something intensely private, while practically everyone in your extended family treats it as a group project. Yet these practices were not merely products of ignorance. They were attempts to create certainty, where certainty did not exist. Ancient couples could not measure hormones or understand genetic conditions. They had no modern fertility testing, and only a limited understanding of reproductive anatomy. What they did have were traditions. They had gods associated with marriage and childbirth. They had physicians offering theories. They had foods believed to strengthen the body. They had charms promising protection. And they had rituals that gave them something practical to do while they waited. Sometimes pregnancy followed. When it did, the successful method could suddenly gain enormous credibility. Perhaps the goddess had answered. Perhaps the amulet worked. Perhaps the special food had restored balance. Nobody could know. And that uncertainty allowed fertility traditions to survive for generations. So ancient couples tried almost everything available to them, from solemn temple offerings to remedies that would make most modern patients quietly leave the room. Not because ancient people were foolish, but because wanting children while being unable to understand why they were not coming created the same thing it creates today: hope. And when the future of your family seemed to depend on it, even the strangest ritual could feel worth trying. For many ordinary Romans, home was not a peaceful marble villa with fountains, gardens, servants, and a suspicious number of reclining couches. It was an insula. These apartment buildings filled the crowded neighbourhoods of Rome, housing large numbers of people above shops, workshops, taverns, and businesses. And while they helped solve the obvious problem of fitting an enormous population into limited urban space, they created several exciting new problems, mostly involving fire, gravity, and landlords. Roman apartment life varied enormously depending on how much money you had. Better apartments were generally found on the lower floors. They could offer larger rooms, easier access to the street, and the comforting knowledge that escaping the building did not require descending several flights of stairs. The poorest tenants often lived higher up, and this was where life became considerably less pleasant. Upper-floor apartments could be small and cramped. Carrying water upstairs was inconvenient, sanitation could be poor, and getting furniture or supplies into your home meant hauling everything through narrow stairways. Then there was the weather. During summer, upper rooms could become brutally hot beneath the roof. During winter, poorly protected rooms could become cold and uncomfortable. But discomfort was only part of the problem. The building itself might be dangerous. Roman writers complained about badly constructed apartment blocks, and landlords had an obvious financial incentive to squeeze as much rentable space as possible from valuable urban land. Construction quality therefore varied. Cracks in walls were not necessarily charming architectural details. They could be warnings. Buildings could collapse, sometimes because of poor construction, structural weakness, or damage caused by other disasters. And if your apartment remained standing, you still had Rome's most persistent urban nightmare waiting for you: fire. Inside these buildings were oil lamps, cook and flames, braziers, wooden furniture, textiles, and other materials capable of burning. Apartments were packed closely together along narrow streets, allowing flames to spread rapidly. There were no smoke detectors, no modern fire alarms, no convenient emergency staircase glowing reassuringly in the darkness. If flames started below you, your main evacuation plan might involve noticing the smoke before everyone else did. So returning home after a long Roman workday did not necessarily mean reaching safety. Your apartment could be overcrowded, uncomfortable, poorly built, and surrounded by open flames. And unfortunately, the higher your room was, the farther you had to travel when the building decided tonight was the night to become a bonfire. If you were wealthy enough to rent a good apartment on the lower floors of an insula, Roman city life could be reasonably comfortable. If you were poor, Rome had another suggestion: keep climbing. Apartment buildings allowed landlords to place large numbers of tenants on relatively small plots of valuable urban land. This meant adding floors upward, with cheaper accommodation generally available as you moved farther from street level. Unfortunately, the stairs were not carrying you toward luxury. The upper apartments were often smaller and less convenient. Water was one of the biggest problems. Rome possessed an extraordinary system of aqueducts, fountains, baths, and public water supplies. But that did not mean every apartment had water conveniently flowing from a private tap. For many tenants, water had to be collected elsewhere and carried home. If you lived several floors above the street, congratulations. Your drinking water had become exercise. Everything else had to make the same journey. Food, fuel, household objects, and anything purchased from the street needed to be carried upstairs through stairways that could be narrow and steep. Then came sanitation. Private toilets were not guaranteed, especially in cheaper accommodation. Residents could depend on communal facilities, chamber pots, or other arrangements that would make a modern apartment complaint about weak water pressure seem wonderfully innocent. Upper rooms also suffered from temperature extremes. Heat rose through crowded buildings, while rooms directly beneath the roof could become unpleasant during the Roman summer. In colder weather, tenants relied on clothing, blankets, and heating methods that introduced another problem: fire. Even everyday cooking could be difficult. Some apartments had limited cooking arrangements, encouraging residents to purchase prepared food from shops and food vendors below. This was convenient until you remembered that the ground floor of your building might contain businesses using their own flames, ovens, lamps, and equipment. So the poorer you were, the farther you often lived from the street, and the more difficult ordinary life became. And there was another uncomfortable detail. When something went wrong, wealthy residents downstairs had the shortest escape route. The poorest residents upstairs had the longest. A collapsing wall was dangerous anywhere. A fire spreading from below was particularly terrifying when several floors separated you from the street. Your cheap rent had therefore purchased an excellent view of Rome, along with considerably more stairs between you and survival. And those stairs mattered because Roman apartment buildings had one enemy that appeared again and again. A tiny flame in exactly the wrong place. If there was one danger that could make every resident of a Roman insula nervous, it was fire. Rome was extremely good at providing fires with opportunities. Inside apartments, people depended on open flames for everyday life. Oil lamps provided light. Braziers could provide warmth. Cooking required heat, whether it happened inside the building or in one of the many shops and food businesses below. Then surround those flames with wooden furniture, doors, shutters, textiles, stored goods, and crowded rooms. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Except constantly. A lamp could overturn. Cooking could be left unattended. Hot coals could escape from a brazier. A workshop on the ground floor might contain particularly flammable materials. Once a fire started, the density of Rome made matters worse. Buildings stood close together along narrow streets. Flames could spread from one structure to another, while smoke filled rooms and stairways. For someone living high inside an insula, the situation could become terrifyingly simple. There was usually one obvious way down: the stairs. If flames or smoke reached that route first, tenants above could become trapped. Roman authorities were well aware of the danger. Augustus established the vigiles, an organised force responsible for watching the streets at night and responding to fires. They carried equipment such as buckets, hooks, axes, and pumps, and could demolish parts of structures when necessary to stop flames spreading. It was an impressive development in urban firefighting. It was not, unfortunately, a sprinkler system. A major blaze could still move faster than firefighters could control it. Rome experienced several famous fires, including the enormous fire during Nero's reign in the year 64. But smaller fires were part of the ordinary urban threat as well. And even surviving the flames could create another problem. Fire weakened buildings. Walls and floors damaged by heat could collapse, turning one disaster into another. So imagine trying to sleep in an upper floor apartment. Somewhere nearby, hundreds of lamps are burning. People are cooking. Braziers are glowing. Shops are operating below residential rooms. Your neighbours are separated from you by construction that may or may not deserve your complete confidence. And your fire alarm is essentially someone screaming. Roman apartment life required accepting that a tiny household flame could become a neighbourhood catastrophe. But even if every lamp behaved itself and nobody accidentally started a fire, your insula could still betray you. Because sometimes the building did not need to burn. Sometimes it simply fell down. Fire was frightening because you could smell smoke, see flames, and hear people shouting. A collapsing apartment building could be less considerate. Roman writers repeatedly complained about the danger posed by poorly constructed buildings. Rome's enormous population created constant demand for housing, and valuable urban land encouraged property owners to build upward. More floors meant more apartments meant more rent, and somewhere in that calculation, structural confidence occasionally became optional. Roman authorities tried to control excessive construction. Emperors introduced restrictions on building heights, partly because extremely tall apartment blocks increased the danger of collapse and fire. But regulations could not magically transform every insula into a masterpiece of Roman engineering. Construction quality varied enormously. Some apartment buildings were solid structures, built with brick-faced concrete and other durable materials. Others could contain weaker walls, timber elements, poor foundations, cheap repairs, or questionable alterations made over years of use. And landlords had financial incentives to keep buildings occupied. If a wall developed a crack, immediately rebuilding half the property was expensive. Watching the crack carefully and hoping for the best was considerably cheaper. Tenants were therefore living inside structures they did not control. Imagine hearing strange noises during the night. Perhaps it was your neighbour. Perhaps it was a cart outside. Perhaps your wall was reconsidering its commitment to being vertical. Heavy rain could create additional problems. Water damage might weaken structures, while fires could leave surviving walls dangerously unstable. Renovations and additions could also place extra stress on buildings, and because Roman streets were densely packed, one collapse could threaten more than the people living inside the structure itself. Falling masonry and timber could crash into the street or damage neighbouring properties. For tenants on upper floors, there was very little they could do. You could not inspect the foundations yourself. You probably had no meaningful influence over construction standards, and moving somewhere safer required money. This is where Roman housing exposed the enormous differences between rich and poor. A wealthy Roman might occupy a spacious private house or a comfortable lower-floor apartment. A poor labourer could find himself several stories above the street inside a building maintained primarily because somebody wanted the rent. Cheap housing solved an immediate problem. You had somewhere to sleep. Whether that somewhere remained standing was another matter. But structural collapse was still only one part of everyday apartment misery. Because even when the building stayed upright and nobody started a fire, you still had to share it with dozens of other Romans. And Romans were not famous for being quiet neighbours. If your insula managed to avoid burning down or collapsing, congratulations. Now you simply had to live in it. Roman apartment buildings could house large numbers of people in a relatively small amount of space. Families, labourers, craftsmen, shopkeepers, migrants, and poorer residents were squeezed together in buildings where privacy was often limited, and Rome itself was already noisy. Very noisy. During the day, streets were packed with merchants, customers, animals, construction workers, craftsmen, and people shouting over one another. Workshops on the lower floors could produce noise from early morning onward. At night, things did not necessarily improve, because daytime traffic restrictions limited when certain carts could move through parts of Rome. Heavy wagons sometimes travelled after dark. Their wooden wheels rattled across stone streets, while drivers shouted and animals contributed their own opinions. If you lived directly above the street, peaceful sleep could become ambitious. Then there were your neighbours. Walls and floors did not provide modern soundproofing. Conversations, arguments, crying children, footsteps, household work, and whatever questionable activity was happening next door could easily become part of your evening. Privacy was therefore something wealth helped purchase. Poorer tenants often occupied smaller spaces and might share rooms with family members or other occupants. Living quarters could be used for sleeping, storing possessions, working and eating. There was not always a separate room for every activity. Sometimes there was barely a separate corner. Sanitation made overcrowding even less pleasant. Many apartments lacked private toilets and direct water supplies. Residents depended on public fountains, baths, latrines, and chamber pots. Waste had to go somewhere. And when dozens of people were living above a busy Roman street, somewhere occasionally became an unpleasantly flexible concept. Ancient sources even mention the danger of material being thrown from buildings onto people below. So walking beneath apartment windows could require a certain amount of faith. Smells were another unavoidable part of urban life. Cooking smoke mixed with workshops, animals, drains, human waste, food businesses, and crowds. Your apartment was therefore connected to the neighbourhood whether you liked it or not. You heard Rome. You smelled Rome. And depending on what came through the window, you occasionally wore Rome. Yet millions of ordinary people adapted to this environment because the city offered employment, markets, entertainment, food distributions, social connections, and opportunity. The insula was dangerous and uncomfortable, but it was also home. And the most frustrating part was that many of its everyday inconveniences became worse the moment you needed something extremely basic. Water. Rome was famous for water. Aqueducts carried enormous quantities into the city. Public fountains flowed through neighbourhoods. Bathhouses offered pools and heated rooms. Wealthy homes could sometimes enjoy private supplies. So naturally, if you lived several floors up in a cheap insula, getting water could still be annoying. Most ordinary apartments did not have anything resembling modern plumbing. Instead, residents could collect water from public fountains and other neighbourhood sources, then carry it home. For someone living near street level, this was inconvenient. For someone living on the 5th floor, it was basically part of the exercise routine. Every container of water needed to travel upstairs, and water was required constantly. You needed it for drinking, basic washing, cleaning, and preparing food. A household, therefore, had to balance how much water it wanted against how many times someone was willing to walk back down the stairs. This also helps explain why public baths were so important. Instead of filling a private bathtub at home, Romans could visit one of the city's bathhouses. Even relatively ordinary people had access to bathing facilities that were extraordinary by ancient standards. But impressive public infrastructure did not automatically mean comfortable private living. The same city capable of constructing gigantic aqueducts could still leave you carrying a heavy water jar up multiple flights of stairs. Then there was the toilet problem. Some buildings had access to latrines or drainage arrangements, but many tenants depended on chamber pots and public facilities. Waste, therefore, had to be removed somehow. Ideally, this involved carrying it downstairs. The word ideally is doing important work here. Roman laws and literary sources refer to objects or liquids being thrown or poured from buildings, suggesting that pedestrians occasionally experienced unpleasant surprises from above. Walking beneath an apartment window could therefore involve more risk than architecture alone. And poor sanitation created smells. Add crowded rooms, cooking smoke, workshops, animals, rubbish, drains, and summer heat, and an insula could become a remarkably intense environment for the nose. Yet people adapted. They collected water from fountains. They visited public baths. They bought prepared food rather than cooking everything at home. They used public latrines. Roman city life depended heavily on shared infrastructure because individual apartments often lacked basic facilities. This made the neighbourhood almost an extension of your home. Your water was outside. Your bath was outside. Your food might be prepared outside. Your toilet might also be outside. Home was mainly where you slept, assuming, of course, that the noise allowed you to sleep, and assuming the building was still there in the morning. After everything we have covered, Roman apartment life begins to sound like a questionable arrangement. Your building might catch fire, it might collapse, your neighbours might keep you awake. You carried water upstairs, depended on public facilities, and occasionally had to worry about whatever someone above you was throwing from a window. So, why would anyone willingly live in an insula? Because for ordinary Romans, there often was not a better practical option. Rome was enormous, crowded, and economically attractive. People came looking for work, trade, political connections, entertainment, and opportunities that smaller towns could not provide. Living close to the centre of that activity mattered. An apartment placed you near markets, workshops, taverns, bathhouses, temples, fountains, and public entertainment. The city itself compensated for some of what your home lacked. No private bath? There were public baths? No water supply upstairs? There were fountains nearby? No comfortable kitchen? Food sellers and taverns filled the streets. Your apartment might have been basic, but Rome existed immediately outside the door. And this is important, because an insula was not necessarily a miserable slum from top to bottom. Quality varied enormously. Some buildings contained respectable apartments occupied by people who were neither desperately poor nor extraordinarily wealthy. Lower floors could offer surprisingly comfortable accommodation. The danger increased when buildings were poorly constructed, badly maintained, overcrowded, or filled with tenants who could afford little else. Rome's authorities understood these risks. Building height regulations were introduced, firefighting organisations developed, and construction standards changed over time. But governing a gigantic ancient city was difficult. There was no modern building inspector arriving with a clipboard every time your ceiling developed a suspicious personality. Landlords wanted rent, tenants needed housing, and Rome continued growing. So the insula survived, because it solved one enormous problem extremely well. It put many people into limited space. Everything else was somewhat less successful. Yet these apartment blocks also reveal something easy to forget about ancient Rome. Most Romans did not experience their city through marble palaces and luxurious villas. Their Rome was staircases, rented rooms, noisy streets, public fountains, food stalls, neighbours, smoke, and crowded buildings. The monumental Rome we admire today was only one version of the city. Behind the temples and triumphal arches were ordinary people trying to get through another day, without their landlord raising the rent or their apartment becoming structurally adventurous. For them, the insula was not ancient history. It was simply home. And every morning that home was still standing was, in its own quiet way, good news.